The wind howled through the dense pine trees as Daniel Carter adjusted his backpack, his breath fogging in the crisp mountain air. He had been hiking for days, reveling in the solitude, seeking the peace that the modern world no longer offered. His plan was simple: spend a week off the grid, away from the clamor of city life, and reconnect with the raw beauty of nature. But nature, as he was about to learn, had its own plans. As he maneuvered a rocky incline, a faint sound reached his ears. At first he dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on him, but then it came again, a low, pained whimper, barely audible over the rustling leaves. Curiosity and something deeper, something instinctual propelled him forward. He followed the sound, his boots crunching against fallen twigs. The trees thinned, revealing a small clearing bathed in the pale light of the rising moon. And there, curled up against the base of a fallen log, was a wolf. Daniel froze. The animal's fur was matted, its breathing labored. A dark stain spread across its side, a fresh wound glistening in the moonlight. But what struck Daniel most was its eyes, golden, intelligent, and filled with a silent plea. A plea for help. Every survival instinct in Daniel screamed at him to back away. A wounded animal, especially a predator, was unpredictable, possibly dangerous. But he couldn't ignore the quiet suffering before him. Slowly, he crouched down, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The wolf flinched but did not attempt to flee. It was too weak. Inspecting the wound, Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't the work of another animal. The gash was too precise, too clean. A knife wound? A trap? He hesitated. Helping this wolf meant risking his own safety, but walking away meant leaving it to a slow, agonizing death. He sighed. "Well, buddy, looks like we're stuck with each other." Taking off his pack, he retrieved a small first aid kit. His supplies were limited: some antiseptic, gauze, and a bottle of water. Carefully he poured the water over the wound, washing away the dirt and dried blood. The wolf let out a low growl but did not resist. Daniel worked quickly, wrapping the wound as best he could. "That should hold for now," he said, securing the bandage. "But you need rest." The wolf's breathing slowed, exhaustion winning over fear. Daniel sat beside it, leaning against the fallen log, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. Somewhere in the darkness, a new question formed in his mind. Who had done this? Morning came with the whisper of rustling leaves and the distant call of a hawk. Daniel stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from sleeping against the hard earth. Beside him, the wolf stirred, its ears twitching. "You're still here," Daniel murmured. He had half expected the animal to vanish into the woods during the night, but it hadn't. Perhaps it sensed what he had already begun to suspect: going alone in its condition would be a death sentence. Daniel repacked his supplies, leaving space for the unexpected travel companion. "Come on," he said, gesturing down the path. "We need to keep moving." The wolf hesitated, but eventually rose to its feet, limping slightly. They moved together, an unspoken understanding forming between them. As they walked, Daniel's mind churned. The precise nature of the injury suggested human interference. But who would attack a wolf in the middle of nowhere? His unease deepened when he found the first sign: boot prints in the mud, partially washed away by the night's dew. Not his own. Someone else had been here. Days passed. The wolf, whom Daniel had taken to calling Spirit for its silent resilience, was growing stronger. The wound was healing, but the questions surrounding it remained unanswered. Then, one evening, as they made camp by a slow-moving stream, Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. A mark on a nearby tree. a crude symbol carved into the bark, a warning or a claim? He wasn't alone in this wilderness, and whoever else was out here, they had left that wolf to die for a reason. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows lengthened around their small campsite. Spirit lifted his head, ears pricked forward, body tense. Something was watching them. And for the first time, Daniel realized that helping Spirit might have put him in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The wind howled through the dense forest, rustling the branches of ancient pines as Daniel crouched beside the wounded wolf. His breath was heavy, the damp earth beneath him cold and unwelcoming, but he couldn't abandon the creature. Something about the way the wolf had sought him out, its golden eyes locked onto his with an unspoken plea, and stirred something deep inside him, a connection beyond logic. The wound on the wolf's side was deep, but not fresh. It had been inflicted with precision, not the careless slash of a predator, but something more deliberate. A hunter, perhaps. Or worse, someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. The thought sent a chill through Daniel. He reached into his pack for the small first aid kit he always carried on his hikes, knowing it wouldn't be enough to fully treat the injury, but determined to do what he could. The wolf whimpered but didn't move as Daniel dabbed antiseptic onto the wound, his hands surprisingly steady. It was a miracle the animal allowed him to get this close at all. Wolves were wild, unpredictable creatures, yet this one seemed to understand that he was trying to help. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" Daniel murmured, brushing a hand lightly over the wolf's thick fur. The animal's breathing was labored, but its ears twitched in response. "Yeah, I thought so." The forest around them was eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant call of an owl. Something about the stillness unnerved Daniel. He had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that silence often meant something was wrong. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Nothing. After securing a makeshift bandage around the wolf's torso, he sat back on his heels and sighed. He couldn't leave the animal here, it wouldn't survive the night alone in this condition. But bringing a wild wolf back to his cabin was a risk. If it regained its strength, would it still trust him? Would it turn on him? The wolf, as if sensing his hesitation, rested its head on its front paws, exhausted. It wasn't going anywhere on its own. Decision made, Daniel carefully lifted the animal, its surprising weight nearly knocking him off balance, and started toward his cabin. The journey was slow, every step deliberate as Daniel maneuvered through the dense underbrush, the wolf cradled in his arms. By the time he reached the clearing where his cabin stood, sweat dripped down his brow despite the cold night air. His cabin was modest, built by his own hands years ago when he had first retreated from the world to find solace in solitude. Now, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. Laying the wolf gently on an old blanket near the fireplace, he stoked the dying embers back to life, letting the warmth fill the room. The animal stirred, watching him with weary eyes. "Don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you," Daniel reassured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking more to the wolf or to himself. As the fire crackled, he tended to his unexpected guest with more care than he had shown anyone in years. He had come to the wilderness to escape, to leave behind a past filled with broken promises and regret. Yet here he was, nursing a wounded creature as if it were the most important thing in the world. By morning, the wolf had managed to stand, its balance shaky but improving. Daniel watched in quiet admiration as it took a few tentative steps before collapsing back onto the blanket. "Yeah, I know the feeling," he said, sipping his coffee. "One step at a time." The days passed in a slow, steady rhythm. The wolf whom Daniel had started calling Ghost for its pale fur and the way it moved silently through the cabin, grew stronger. It never tried to leave, nor did it show any aggression. If anything, it seemed to have accepted Daniel as its pack, following him around the cabin and watching his every move with sharp, intelligent eyes. But there was always that lingering question: who had hurt Ghost in the first place? One evening, as Daniel chopped wood outside, he heard a distant howl, haunting and filled with sorrow. Ghost, who had been resting on the porch, lifted his head, ears perked. Another howl followed, this one closer. Daniel set down the axe, a deep unease settling in his chest. Wolves didn't usually venture this close to human habitation, not unless something had forced them out of their territory. Ghost let out a low growl, standing on unsteady legs. It was the first time Daniel had seen real fear in the wolf's eyes. Then, from the shadows of the trees, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, and another, and another. Daniel reached for the rifle he kept near the door, his pulse pounding. Something was very, very wrong. The realization settled over Daniel like a heavy fog. Whoever had injured Ghost had not only left the wolf to die, but had also sent those other wolves after him. He wasn't sure if they had been trained or merely coerced by fear. But one thing was clear: there was intent behind their actions. This was no random encounter. He grabbed his hunting knife from the wooden table and strapped it to his belt. His rifle was loaded, but he didn't want to use it unless he absolutely had to. Wolves weren't his enemies. People, on the other hand, could be far worse. Ghost lay near the fireplace, his breathing still heavy but less labored than before. The wolf's eyes met his, and for a brief moment there was understanding. Daniel wasn't sure how much Ghost knew, but he could feel the animal's unease. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line. The forest had gone eerily silent again. No wind rustled the branches. No nocturnal animals stirred. It was as if everything was waiting. And then he heard it, the same sharp whistle, distant but unmistakable. He turned sharply, his breath catching. A figure moved between the trees, just on the edge of his vision, too far to make out details, but close enough to confirm that someone was watching. Daniel wasn't about to wait for them to come to him. He stepped off the porch and into the night. The cold air bit at his skin as he moved through the trees, staying low and quiet. Years of living in solitude had honed his instincts. He knew how to walk without making a sound, how to use the forest as cover. Whoever this was, they had the advantage of numbers. But Daniel had something else: determination. Ghost had followed him, limping but silent. The wolf's ears were perked, his body tense, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to snap. Then, another movement in the distance, a shadow slipping between the trees. Daniel knelt, raising his rifle just enough to sight along the barrel. He wouldn't shoot unless necessary, but he needed to be ready. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man dressed in dark, weather-worn clothing. His face was obscured by a hood, but Daniel could see the glint of something metallic strapped to his side. A knife. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice smooth, almost conversational. Daniel stayed quiet, watching. The man tilted his head, regarding him like he was an animal himself. "That wolf doesn't belong to you." Daniel tightened his grip on the rifle. "It doesn't belong to anyone." The stranger smirked. "Everything belongs to someone." There was a rustling behind Daniel. He didn't turn, but he knew there were more of them. He could feel their presence, closing in like a tightening noose. "That wolf is part of something bigger," the man continued, taking a slow step forward. "And you've put yourself right in the middle of it." Daniel exhaled slowly, keeping his nerves steady. "You hurt him." The stranger shrugged. "Had to. He ran. That wasn't supposed to happen." Ghost growled low, stepping closer to Daniel. The man's gaze flickered to the wolf, something almost like amusement crossing his face. He remembers. Daniel had heard enough. Leave, he said coldly. Now. The man sighed as if disappointed. You don't understand what you're involved in. Then why don't you explain it to me? The man smiled. Because that wouldn't be any fun. And then he whistled. The woods erupted. Daniel barely had time to react before the shadows lunged at him. Wolves larger than Ghost, their fur slick with sweat and dirt, rushed from the darkness, teeth bared. Ghost reacted first. Despite his injuries, he launched himself at the closest wolf, knocking it sideways before it could reach Daniel. Daniel raised his rifle, firing a warning shot into the air. The crack of the bullet echoed through the trees, momentarily halting the attack. The stranger didn't flinch. If anything, he looked amused. You don't want to do that. Daniel aimed directly at him. Try me. The man studied him for a moment, then let out another sharp whistle. The wolves hesitated, their ears twitching. Then, one by one, they retreated into the darkness. The stranger took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. This isn't over, he said. Not for you, not for the wolf. And then he was gone. Daniel stood there, heart pounding, the rifle still raised. Ghost limped back to his side, his breathing ragged. Daniel looked down at him, exhaling slowly. What the hell have we gotten ourselves into? The forest didn't answer. But Daniel knew one thing. This was just the beginning. The night stretched long and heavy around Daniel, the weight of the encounter pressing into his chest like a stone. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. This isn't over. No, it wasn't, and Daniel wasn't one to back down. Ghost let out a low, tired huff, leaning against him. The wolf was still weak, but his spirit was intact. He had fought for his life once already, and tonight he had fought again. But there was something deeper in those golden eyes now, something resolute, something knowing. Daniel knew he had a choice. He could pack up, disappear into the wilderness like he always had. Let this go. Or he could find out the truth. Because this wasn't just about a wounded wolf anymore. Someone had sent those wolves after him. Someone had hurt Ghost for a reason. And that meant there was someone out there who needed to be stopped. The wind shifted, rustling the trees, carrying the distant sound of another whistle. Softer this time, fainter. A warning? A promise? Daniel didn't know. But as he stood in the cold, rifle in hand, Ghost at his side, he realized something. He wasn't just running anymore. He was hunting. And he wasn't going to stop until he found the truth.